Hello. Well, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about where method comes from and also what to do with it. So we have this whole world, there's this ocean of uncertainty. How do we turn our ideas about the research problem and also our theories, how do we turn them into a doable program? How do you turn it into a list of tasks that you can sort of tick off as you do them, and you can see that you're moving from your research problem over to the conclusion and a polished project? So let's begin. Right. Well, like theory, method is just another tool that gets you from the problem to a conclusion. And it includes concepts, it includes categories, it includes measures, and it includes models. So firstly, when you think about method, what are those concepts? What are those categories? What are those measures? What are those models that you're using? But also, what are the definitions that you're using? How do you define these concepts? How do you define the categories? How do you define the measures? And how do you define the models? And of course, how you do that all comes from theory. So it also goes back to the discussion about what is theory. But method always comes from theory. It's always informed by theory. So as said then, where method comes from, it comes from theory, but it's two different types of theory. It's theory that's directly relevant to the research problem. So basically, how have others investigated the issue before? But also it comes from ideas about how to do social science. What is the theory of social science? And of course, as you know, there's many different understandings of how to do social science. So to what extent, what theories about social science are informing your methodological considerations? So how to do social science? This, of course, is a very open question, but you make decisions. You have to decide how do you do social science. And you make that decision both because you need to be able to argue that it's relevant to researching your problem. So can you argue that basically? If you can't, then it's not relevant. And you shouldn't be using that method. But on the other hand, if you can argue that it's relevant, then use it. But also, it's really informed by your interests. You know, what ideas about social science interest you? Do you tend to find statistics most interesting? Would you rather do qualitative interviews, textual analysis, all those kind of things? But also you have to think through, you know, what are the consequences for your dissertation? That's very much about what you want to do, but also its practicalities. You know, it's always a problem when you do research, when you face the real world, because you have to think, well, if I want to interview these different people and do face-to-face interviews, I have to go to them or they have to come to me. How do you make that happen? How do you travel? Do you have the funding for that kind of travel? Do you have access to the documents of the minutes of meetings which might otherwise be confidential, but which are necessary for your research? If you don't have that access, if there are those practical problems that you might face, then instead of just seeing them as an obstruction, turn that round to be an advantage. So it helps just tell you, it helps narrow down your focus. It gives you a much clearer idea of what sort of social science you should be doing within this project. Next, of course, you might think through whether or not to do quantitative or qualitative approaches, though in general, these two categories aren't mutually exclusive. At the heart of any quantitative approach is always some kind of qualitative consideration, at least to the extent that you have to qualitatively think through, argue why you've used the measures, the categories that you have. So thinking through it that way, thinking through quantitative measures, quantitative methods as being ultimately qualitative, it's helpful here just because it helps remind you about the kind of things you could say within your methodology, the kind of things that you need to, again, explain those measures, explain the categories. Also, you need to ask yourself, can you just do a single case study? Should you look at several different cases as a comparison? Or should you do a large N comparison? Within there is this issue of generalizability, although that still remains debated about how generalizable a single case study is for your overall field. But also, of course, it affects how thin or thick your descriptions can be. So if you do a lot of cases, your descriptions will usually be quite thin in the sense that you can't go in depth that much into the cases. If you do a single case study or a few cases, your description can be usually much thicker. You have a much, there's also simply more space to be able to discuss your cases, your few cases in detail here. Of course, also look in general methodology books, but the most useful approach is to see how have other people working in your field done this type of research before. So again, that comes from your research problem, your theory. What are the concepts, models other people have been using when dealing with your type of research problem? It also might, both might suggest ideas. It might also show what hasn't been done. You know, where there's a gap, where there's a lack within the literature. What could you bring in to advance that literature? One book that you might want to consider is Ben Flubier's Making Social Science Matter, which is a good argument, presents a strong argument for the case study as being generalizable, but that's certainly something worth considering anyway. Of course, you need to make sure that the methodological approaches you use fit ontologically. Potentially, it might be also that in order to improve the reliability of your findings, you can use the number 3, triangulation, to help you. So, for example, in a study on NGOs, you might include 1, textual analysis of their documents, in-depth interviews, and a general survey. 3 different things. 3 is always more than 2. 1's certainly enough, 2's not really enough, 3 is fine, 4 probably that's just too much, but 3, that's a good number. It also might be that you want to mix quantitative and qualitative approaches. So for example, a study on Bolivian politics might include an in-depth case study, as well as a comparative analysis of Latin American politics. Okay, so to consider then, you need to ask the why. You know, why do you choose the method that you do? Okay, what do you want to do with it? How will you use the method? If there are multiple methods, how do you relate them to one another? But throughout those considerations, keep looking back to the problem argument overview, because that's what's going to tell you what's relevant. That's what's going to tell you whether or not your ideas about how to write your text, the method and so on, are actually correct. Also practicalities, you know, what are the practical considerations here? This was mentioned just a bit earlier, but you know, you can use those practicalities to narrow down your focus. And also, as the data comes in, it gets, perhaps, if you get a lot of data, it becomes increasingly difficult to manage. So how are you going to handle this data? How are you going to process it? You need to think through how you're going to calculate it, how you're going to schedule yourself, schedule your work time, so that you can actually have the resources to be able to process this data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Okay, so just to conclude then, as always, having talked about methods, is just to say, have fun with your paper.